Broadcasting on the internet airwaves from the great state of Minnesota. My name is Shaun, and you're listening to The Shaun Tabatt Show. Today, my special guest is Bob Pritchett, and we're talking about his new book, Start Next Now, How to Get the Life You've Always Wanted, which is published by Kirkdale Press. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Shaun.
Well, Bob, first off, I'd love to help the audience get to know you a little bit better, and I always like to get a bit into everybody's background and journey. So first up, I'd love to hear just a little bit about your family life and what was your church background like when you were growing up?
So I grew up in a family that went to church. My dad had gone to seminary and never went into the pastorate, but had that educational background and grew up with going to Christian schools, having to take Bible class 5 days a week. And I think that kind of influenced my future in Bible software.
Thanks for helping us to get to know that part of your life a little bit better. One of the things I found really interesting in the book is you give us a window into some of your early entrepreneurial efforts. What were some of those first businesses that you cut your business teeth on, so to speak, as a kid?
Well, my dad had an entrepreneurial mindset and had started businesses and did entrepreneurial projects, and he kind of encouraged me that way. So it seemed like every idea about a cool thing to do was an opportunity to make that a business. So one of the first things I remember doing was selling vegetables from the garden door to door in the neighborhood, which was a great experience of, knocking on doors and selling the excess zucchini and tomatoes. Then later, my dad read an article about beekeeping and suggested to me that keeping a beehive and selling honey might be a great business. So we went and bought beehives, put them in our suburban neighborhood backyard, and I got into the honey business, selling honey from a stand on the street in front of the house and to people at church and things like that. So just very early on, kind of got the idea that anything that could be a business was something you could just go and start doing.
That's great. I think it's so important as we have kids and are raising them to push them into some of these entrepreneurial efforts and things where they're going to have to be in front of people and selling things and pitching to some extent, because those are skills that we not only use in business, but really we use those in all areas of life.
Absolutely.
So going into your high school years, you were continuing to be entrepreneurial in some of your pursuits. If I remember correctly from the book, you had your own little tech or software type company that you were working on. Eventually, you end up at Microsoft, and ultimately you begin working on what would become Logos and eventually Faith Life. Talk to us a bit about that portion of your journey.
Well, I was really interested in computers, and so I learned to program, and my dad introduced me to some people who told me about the kind of professional programming languages and helped me find books that would let me learn the tools. So most of my friends were, on a Commodore 64 writing games in BASIC. I had an IBM PC clone and was writing in the C programming language, which was what the professionals were using then. And I got this idea to build a toolkit. Since I didn't have a program I wanted to write, I wrote toolkits to help programmers. Lots of little utility functions, things that manage the screen and the user interface. And I started selling that over computer bulletin boards. And it was one of those things where, I gave it away as we called shareware back then. If you wanted to buy the source code, you could pay a fee and send a check in the mail for it. And it started working. So I got enough money during high school to attend a Microsoft conference. I actually got to go to the Windows 1.0 Developers Conference when I was a freshman in high school, and to buy my first car, which was a lot of fun to do that on my own income. And that really is where I started to get the real taste for going into business and seeing how you could take something that was a hobby or an interest and turn that into something profitable, right? And I was just doing that around high school, doing it after school and in the evenings. And then that led to writing my first Bible software program and then eventually to working at Microsoft.
Well, it's always fun to meet guys who have a tech background, but were a part of those early bulletin boarding days. I find I meet fewer and fewer folks who actually had any experience with the BBS realm. So fun to hear that you started out BBSing and with shareware. That's a great part of your story.
Yeah, it's hard to explain sometimes to my kids. It's like before the internet, we had to, hook a phone up to the computer and call one other computer, and only one person could be online at a time. It was such a different world.
Yes, it definitely was. Well, one of the things that I've always appreciated about your company, as I've been a customer and watched through the years, you've been so much more than just a Bible software company. Besides your flagship software product, you've got a magazine. Now you've got 2 book imprints. You recently developed a mobile education platform, and that's just a portion of the things that you have going on right now at Faith Life. What is it that has allowed your company to be so innovative? That's not something that we always see from a lot of Christian or faith-based organizations. Why have you or your organization been able to be different?
Well, I think at one level, it's just curiosity and enthusiasm. So I love business. I love learning new things. And all of these ventures are ways to, learn something different. When we first started putting out the Bible Study magazine in paper, that was a total stretch for a software company, right? And we knew nothing about creating a periodical and putting it out every 2 months. But we learned that. It was a lot of fun. We learned a huge amount of new skills. And then what we try to do in everything we do is find ways to basically get two birds with one stone. How can we make what we learn in this area help us somewhere else? So building subscription management and circulation management for a magazine eventually led to our being able to offer Logos Bible software by subscription. We've used the same code and the same what we learned from the customer service of canceling and extending and doing things with subscription management. All of that eventually paid off, even in the digital realm. And so we're, like I said, launching book imprints, the magazines, lots of other things that are all related, but actually all connected. Even Bible Study Magazine addresses that same audience that buys the Bible software.
Yeah, I think that is one of the most interesting things I've noticed is once you buy into part of the faith life world, it's almost like you've ushered your customer, your user into an entire world or an entire ecosystem.
Exactly. We're building a platform for people's faith life, hence the name. And that platform lets people connect to each other in social groups, to share notes, to do Bible reading plans together. And then, with Proclaim Church presentation software, you can collaborate with the people on your presentation team. So the worship leader and the church secretary and the pastor can all put slides into the same Sunday presentation. And all of those things are connected, right? Then you use Logos Bible software and the pastor can send a verse straight to the Proclaim presentation. And that's just done through the cloud over the internet. It's taken a while to get all of those connections lit up. Behind all these different products, there's this strategy of building a platform that helps address all the parts of people's faith life, whether that's sermon preparation or personal Bible study or running a small group or being the worship leader.
We're just in exciting times, I think as technology continues to change and shift, and obviously your organization is embracing all the opportunities that are available, I think we're going to continue to see more exciting things from you and the folks at Faith Life.
We're working hard on doing that.
Well, now let's, the reason we're talking today is to talk about your new book. Again, the title is Start Next Now. So let's dive into a bit of what you cover there. One of the things you talk about in the first part of the book is, as you were growing up, your parents, you might say gave you permission to try just about anything. And I work with a lot of authors, and I find I'm often helping them to give themselves permission to move ahead, to pursue new things. Talk to us about why that was important for you and why that's something that a lot of us even struggle with when we're adults.
Well, I think it does come from your childhood often, right? And I feel really blessed to have parents who always said, go try it, right? Their advice to everything was, try that. One story I didn't share in the book was in high school. I took the first computer class my high school offered, and we were a small Christian high school, and the computer class was very simplistic about typing in basic programs, and it was taught by the math teacher because he's the person on the faculty who, most knew what a computer was. And at the time, I was way ahead in my programming skills because my dad was in the computer industry and I'd been programming already for quite some time. And I came home and I expressed my frustration that the computer class was not teaching me anything. And I said something like, I could teach that class better because, the math teacher doesn't know anything. And my dad said, well, why don't you make a proposal to teach the computer class? And I'm a sophomore in high school. So I did. And I wrote up a proposal and sent it to the board of trustees for my high school, suggesting that they let me teach a more advanced computer programming course because it was important for the future and, the new thing. And that's incredibly presumptuous for a student to suggest they start teaching a class. But it was just the kind of thing where my dad didn't, say, well, you'll have to wait till you go to college and get a degree and then maybe you could come back and teach a class. It's just like, if you think you could do that, why don't you go ahead and try it? And of course, the school board did not allow me to teach a class. But the teacher did end up making me kind of his assistant, and I got to play some role in instructing and helping. Instead of taking that course, I was kind of the teacher's assistant in the course and taught some of my classmates and friends more about the technology. And it's just that idea of realizing that all these options are open to you. Whatever it is you want to do, there's something you can do to start that right now. And so often instead, people get this idea that they need to wait. They have to wait for permission. They have some gating factor. I need a certification. I need education. I need somebody higher up to say it's okay. And what I want to do is just help give people the same permission my parents gave me to let people know that you can just go ahead and do it.
Wow, that's great. I think of the courage it must have taken to talk to the school board or a teacher about becoming their assistant. And while you didn't get to teach the class per se, you got to take on more responsibilities and do different things that were actually abnormal for a kid your age. So I'm sure that contributed to some level of confidence or a different style of learning than you probably would have had just sitting in the class.
Absolutely. And then I've just seen that pattern over and over again. So everything from, applying to work at Microsoft when I was 17 to going to college early, just kind of not waiting for somebody to say it was okay, but just taking that initiative to do it. And I don't even think of myself as particularly extroverted or bold. It was just being told that all of those things that look like barriers are really just conventions, and you can just walk around them if you want.
I think there's another stage, once we give ourselves permission and we achieve some level of success, a lot of folks will find themselves dealing with what you refer to in the book as the imposter syndrome, where, we're at a point where we're achieving, we're doing some good things, but we all of a sudden start to question and wonder, am I worthy of being here? Am I really good enough to be doing this? Talk to us about, is that something you personally have had to deal with? Is that something you've had to deal with within your organization? Where have you seen that in your life and in those around you?
Well, I think we all have to deal with that, and I've certainly been through that experience many times. So everything from joining Microsoft as a teenager and working with professional software developers when I didn't have any experience or feedback on my code or experience, founding a company and being the boss to people who were older than me and wondering if I knew what I was doing or how to answer the questions that came up. So I've had lots of those experiences, and I still see that with many of my employees. People say, well, I just feel like I'm in over my head, or, I got assigned to be a team lead here, but I don't really know what I'm doing. And that's common and understandable, and it's completely okay. The thing to do is to acknowledge that and then see what that takes you. Say, so I don't know what I'm doing. Great. Let's go learn what I need to learn to do it, and ask for help, because everybody ahead of you in that process has been through it. And even now, when I think back to joining Microsoft as a teenager, when I went full-time at Microsoft right before I turned 20, at that time my boss was 24, right? And his boss was 31. And now I'm much older than both of them. And I look back and think, well, they were incredibly intimidating and the professional experts ahead of me, but they were really only a couple of years down the road, and in some cases had less experience than me.
In my own personal experience as a manager and working at a software company, having to manage people that were really old enough to be my father or be my mother, people that were my parents' age. And here I was, a guy in his early 30s, talk about feeling like an imposter, but embracing and jumping into those situations and learning how to influence and manage and move people along to success. It really changed my life. But when I was starting out and in the midst of that early on, it was far from easy.
Absolutely. It's always scary, and we don't know what we don't know. But the great news is we can ask questions, and it's a lot safer to do that than people imagine. And that's one of the things I talk about in the book, is that, in fact, people ahead of you are anxious and interested in helping you, right? People are flattered to be asked questions. They like to give back and contribute to young people or people even just behind them on the path. And if you approach things with an open attitude and are willing to kind of acknowledge your ignorance, but see it not as a fault, but really just as a situation that you're going to move beyond, there's really no limit to what you can do.
Would definitely agree. I found a lot of success in just sitting down one-on-one with some of those folks, people who had way more experience than I did, and just ask them to partner with me and help me answer questions and help me move along in the organization as a new manager. And it really was a key part of my success there.
Yeah, one of the tools I found that's really helpful in that is to ask for help on the work, not on yourself. People often say, well, am I doing this right? Or did I do a good job? Or they're looking for that kind of feedback. And that's fine, but it can make it personal and emotional in a way that becomes an obstacle or makes us even resistant to getting the feedback. When instead you say, here's my report or here's my work product, how could this be better? Now it becomes a collaboration where we're looking at the product and not criticizing the person or anyone individually. You get better feedback, and it's easier to take and work with.
Sure, and I could see where that would also lend to, teamwork and collaboration. And like you said, it removes that emotional component where you're not criticizing the person necessarily, you're looking at the work.
Right.
One of the things I think a lot of us face today, whether you're just graduating with college, you're starting out, you're new to the workforce, or you're somebody who's been at it for 10, 20 years, it's a big struggle these days to get noticed. If you have this degree or have accomplished this thing, there's another 250 applicants that have those same sorts of accomplishments. What does it look like to set yourself apart and set yourself up for success these days?
I think you're right. It's a noisy world, and we're all getting tons of information and people thrown at us on screens, from Facebook to surfing the web and everything else. But in the places that count, right, the place you work or the space in which you move and interact with people, sometimes it's really the simple things. It can be as simple as making sure people know your name. I work in an organization with 450 people. And it's hard to remember everybody's name. I've probably met everybody, but, people have a hard time over 150 names in any context of keeping track of everyone. The people who reintroduce themselves or just kind of make sure you know their name, it's easier to start a conversation with them. You feel better to have a casual interchange. And that familiarity means that when it comes to, I need to give something to somebody new, I don't know anybody in that department, who can I hand this to or whatever, you just can't help it. You go to the people you're familiar with, the people you have some kind of comfort with, or where you know their name and they're not just a face you saw in the directory. So I think that's a really simple tip, is to keep reintroducing yourself. And it's something I'm trying to do more often when I go into other contexts, even around the downtown that I live in, right? To repeatedly tell people I interact with who I am. That person at that store probably sees 500 customers a day, right? Even though I see them 3 times a week, they may not remember who I am. But if I keep making that introduction, that just makes me stand out from among those 500 people and helps build a relationship.
Whether it's, working on our LinkedIn profile online and giving people ways to find us digitally, like you said, a part of it is being relational and connecting with people. And so for me, I found a lot of success in stepping out behind the screen and, like you said, introducing myself, talking to people, and building face-to-face relationships and doing more than just focusing on virtual relationships. It's got to be a bit of both.
Absolutely. And there's so many, thanks to the internet, you can kind of stand out online. You can put up a blog, you can do something in the space, just what you're doing, creating a podcast, just finding ways to show that little bit of extra interest or initiative that helps you stand out. I point out to our interns and new hires, if you go to a good 4-year school and get a degree in computer science and join us as a software developer, your resume pretty much looks like everyone else's, right? You took data structures and introduction to programming languages, and so did everybody else. They graduated thousands of people with that degree, and they all look exactly the same. And if you can find a way to distinguish yourself just in a small way, I wrote an app, or I did this project for a charity, or took this initiative in any way, that small thing right at the beginning of your career in particular can just be the one difference that lets you build on compounding interest in your reputation and visibility.
Yeah, definitely find some ways to stand out. I've done a lot of recruiting, and we're in the middle of looking for a position right now. And yeah, a lot of those resumes end up looking the same. It's all those little bit of extra things that help you stand out. In the last part of the book, you offer some, what I would say are very practical steps for setting yourself up to reach that next milestone. Talk to us a bit about those. You talk about time, savings, and learning.
Right. I think that time's a big one, right? People say, I don't have time to do something else, but many of us have time to watch 2 to 4 hours of television every night, or to, chill on the couch with Netflix or something like that. That amount of time that we spend on entertainment and all can really be put to better use, particularly if you're in a phase where you want to start something new. I'm as guilty as anyone else, right? It's real easy for me to sit down and watch a movie tonight and relax with my wife on the couch, and I think there's a place for that, and that's a great thing. But the phases in my life where I started something new or was able to kind of line up what the next thing was, those were phases where I didn't have a television or we kept it turned off. Starting my business was a time when I didn't have a couch. So it was great. There was no reason to go home. I stayed at the computer because there was nothing to sit on in the house. And as silly as it sounds, it's that little bit of extra effort. It can only be, it might be an hour each morning before work or an hour or two in the evening after the kids go to bed, is that time you can carve out that helps you prepare for the next thing and gets you out of that mindset that you have to finish something before you can get permission to start the next thing. You can start the next thing right now. And the same way with learning. Oftentimes that extra time goes into learning or research or having conversations with people. And that for me has always been one of the most valuable things, is taking people to coffee, taking people to lunch, just getting access to people who've been down that road before you and picking their brains.
Well, I really like the way that you bring the book to a conclusion where you talk about being intentional. And if we're going to take your advice and put it to use, really, we have to be intentional about everything we're doing. Talk to us about that.
The being intentional is so important. And I think it works 2 ways. You can be intentional about what you're going to do, and you can also be intentional about what you're not going to do. We all, I think, carry this long list of things I'm going to get around to. And it creates cognitive dissonance, right? It's just a baggage that we're carrying around that can slow us down or distract us. So I've really been working on the discipline of not just saying, I'm going to do this thing, An example that would be like writing a book. I had writing a book on my list for a long time. And then I set a deadline. I said, so-and-so is coming to visit and they know somebody in the publishing industry, and I'm going to have a book proposal to hand them when they come over for dinner at my house. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to get that proposal done by that time. And that was actually the impetus to get my first book written, was to hand this proposal to somebody on a date that I knew they were going to show up at my house for dinner and I could put it in their hands. But you can also be intentional about what you're not doing. For years, I had this idea that I was going to learn another language, and I would put a little effort into it and then fall away and go in and out of it. And one day I just decided, at this point, I don't need that language. As much as it would be fun to speak that language, it isn't going to help advance my career or my goals. It would take a lot of time to get fluent in it, and I'm going to take it off my list. And that intentionality freed up brain power. It freed up resources. It freed up all that time I put into sporadically not learning the language, was all freed up to do things that I really was going to be intentional about doing.
Bob, as you were working on this book, was there an ideal reader that you had in the back of your mind? Like, who were you thinking about that you wanted to read this book when it was finished?
At some level, I'm writing for my kids, right? They're both in college, and I think at that phase of figuring out what's next in their life and where their career is going to be. So I'm thinking of my kids and even the interns who join our company. We have a large intern program every year, and it's always fun seeing people who are right at that beginning of their career and kind of figuring out what's going to happen next in their life when they graduate. In a bigger sense, it's really for everyone who's ready for the next thing. And I found that happens at all different ages. We have people in their 30s or 40s in the organization who have gotten to a point where they say, I'm ready for something new, right? And it's in those interviews and conversations where people say, how do I move my career ahead? Or, I finally want to buy a house and I need to know how to get my income up, or whatever it is. And I wanted to give people that permission, which I think is often what they were lacking. They have the skills, they have the potential, they have the capability. It's often that they were waiting. And that's what I discovered for so many people, is that it's that unnecessary waiting that's holding them back. The young person, I say, well, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And they're like, well, 5 years from now, I really don't like my job now, but I really wish I had Joe's job. And I'm like, well, what are you waiting for? And I'm like, well, I guess I was waiting for Joe to die or retire. I'm like, well, let's talk about how you could do Joe's job now so Joe could move up to doing something else. And after seeing people get empowered that way, I just wanted to help more people with that permission and empowerment.
Yeah, I think this would be a definite help to folks who are in the midst of their college journey or just graduating. I think of folks any age, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're working inside a company, really anybody could benefit from this book. We all have things that we desire to work on and want to start, and you're giving them permission to start that next thing. Just start it now.
Absolutely.
As you look back on your journey, are there one or two books that have influenced you most, either as an entrepreneur or as a Christian? It could be either or.
Oh, it's so hard to pick out just a couple. I read a lot of books on business and the entrepreneurial experience. What I really, so I've read like 0 to 1, right? Peter Thiel's book on a different way of thinking about startups and getting things going. Even though I'm more than 20 years into this business, I still think of it as a startup, and we're constantly starting new things. But I also really like reading history and biography, particularly of businesses, because it gives you a toolbox of scenarios that you may encounter in your business and lets you think through problems that you can now look back and get a good perspective on. I particularly enjoyed First Tycoon about Cornelius Vanderbilt, who really lived through the creation of the modern business world in the 19th century. My Life and Work by Henry Ford is a surprisingly practical and still very useful book. It has a lot of nitty-gritty detail about starting the Ford Motor Company, but a lot of very practical advice on how to run a business on a daily basis. And I'm just constantly surprised as well. I shouldn't be surprised, but I always am again at how much the Bible has to say about business, right? We don't always think of it as a guide to business, but particularly in Proverbs and elsewhere through it, it's the stories in the Bible are just endless lessons in leadership and in relations with other people. And it addresses debt and money and all of those things. But the further I go in business, the more I realize it's really about the people. The math isn't that complicated. It's about the people relationships. And as we know, the Bible really speaks to us and to our hearts on that.
Thanks for sharing about those books. If folks are interested in checking out any of those, I'll be sure to include links in the show notes for this episode. And also, I really appreciate what you had to say about biographies. I think especially whether we're in business or we're in ministry, as we read about other men and women throughout history who have been walking the same roads that we're currently on, we have a lot of opportunity to learn from their successes and their failures, see how they handled some of those same problems that we're currently dealing with. And it just puts us in such a better position to make a good or sound decision about how we're going to move forward. So that's really helpful advice. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Well, Bob, if the listeners are interested in connecting with you and finding out more about your book, where's the best place for them to go on the web?
startnextnow.com. So just 3 words in a row, startnextnow.com. We're going to have the links to where you can buy the book, and we'll actually have a full electronic edition of the book on the web where you can read it on the web, kind of build an interactive action plan for your own next steps, and there'll be some video sidebars and interviews that are in that edition that you wouldn't get in the paper book.
Well, and I'll say too, it's a quick read, it's an enjoyable read. I think most people are going to be able to get through it in just 1 or 2 sittings. Very practical, very actionable. I think it's a book a lot of people are going to benefit from.
That's my hope. Thank you.
It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks to all of you for being a part of my conversation today with Bob Pritchett talking about Start Next Now. For more on Bob and his new book, like he said, you can visit startnextnow.com. And if you want to follow Bob on Twitter, you can find him there. He goes by the handle of @BobPritchett. And Bob, I just want to say thanks so much for sharing with us today. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you.
I've really enjoyed it. Thank you, Shaun.
And that's all for this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show. If you have a question, comment, or suggestion, you can connect with me via email using show@shauntabatt.com. Be sure to follow me on Twitter, where I go by the Twitter handle @stabatt. And if you enjoy the show, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. Until next time, this is your host, Shaun Tabatt, signing off.